I was 22 years old when this event occurred. Having recently graduated from college, I was navigating a period between jobs, taking on various odd tasks in my small town for cash, babysitting, house cleaning, running errands, anything that would earn me some money. A woman for whom I had previously dog-sat recommended me to a friend of her neighbors, a man named Craig. One afternoon, he called me to explain that he would be traveling for a week and required someone to stay at his house to care for his golden retriever, Max. He mentioned Max was an anxious dog who fared better with an overnight companion rather than just someone stopping by for feedings. Given the slightly higher than usual pay he offered, I accepted. 2 days later, I met Craig. He appeared to be in his late 40s, tall, wearing wire-rimmed glasses and a windbreaker. Initially, nothing about him struck me as odd, perhaps just a bit overly friendly, but not in a creepy way. His house was located on the outskirts of town, nestled within a wooded area. The property itself was pleasant, though somewhat dated, featuring beige carpets and floral curtains. Craig thoroughly explained everything, detailing Max's walking schedule, the location of the spare key, and which refrigerator items were available for my use. He informed me that I could stay in the guest bedroom, situated just off the living room on the first floor. I began the job on a Monday. The first 2 nights proceeded normally. I watched television in the living room, then took Max for his evening walks, and subsequently slept in the guest room with him curled at the foot of the bed. Problems arose on the 3rd night. I was scrolling through my phone on the bed when I noticed something peculiar. On the dresser opposite the bed, beside a small lamp, sat a digital alarm clock. I recall thinking it didn't fit with the room's decor. It had a newer appearance, made of black plastic with a bright blue LED display, while everything else in the room seemed to belong to the early 2000s. I'm unsure what prompted me to examine it more closely. Perhaps it was the way the lamplight reflected off its front. But as I leaned in, I spotted a small, perfectly round black pinhole situated above the numbers. Initially, I assumed it was merely a sensor, but then I observed its angle. The tiny hole was aimed directly at the bed. My stomach churned. I had read about hidden cameras disguised as alarm clocks before, but I had never encountered one in person. My mind raced. I picked it up. It felt heavier than expected, and there was a faint buzzing sound emanating from within, like a tiny fan. I turned it towards me and stared directly into the pinhole. At that moment, Max, who had been lying by the door, suddenly lifted his head and began to whine. The sound originated from elsewhere in the house, not the front door, but deeper inside. I distinctly heard a door close. Every hair on my body stood on end. Craig wasn't due back until Sunday, and it was only Wednesday night. I froze, clutching the clock, my heart pounding so intensely it almost hurt. Then, I heard slow footsteps on the hallway carpet. I quickly replaced the clock and moved to the door, locking it just as the footsteps paused outside. Craig's voice then came through, calm yet slightly out of breath. He claimed he had left something inside on his last visit and needed me to open the door. I was unable to speak. A moment later, he insisted it wasn't what I thought, explaining it was a motion sensor for the dog, and that he hadn't wanted to alarm me by mentioning it. I backed away from the door, my hand covering my mouth. He told me to come out so we could discuss it like adults, but when I didn't respond, his knocking escalated into pounding. He shouted at me to open the door, his voice no longer calm, but sharp and angry. Max began barking and leaping at the door, which only seemed to agitate Craig further. I glanced at the window, low enough to the ground to climb out, but it was locked. My hands shaking violently, it took me 3 attempts to fumble with and open the latch. Behind me, Craig continued to pound, now yelling that if I didn't open the door, he would retrieve the room's key, call the police, and accuse me of breaking into his house. I didn't wait to hear more. I shoved the window open, awkwardly climbed out, and dropped onto the grass outside. Max scrambled after me, his nails clicking on the windowsill. But he ultimately gave up and didn't jump out. I ran through the side yard and down the gravel driveway until I reached the road. My phone was in my pocket and I called my mum, who lived 15 minutes away. I instructed her to pick me up immediately. By the time she arrived, I was hiding behind a cluster of mailboxes. Craig's house was out of sight from that vantage point, yet I kept looking over my shoulder. I stayed at my mom's for the remainder of the night. The next morning, I blocked Craig's number and contacted a lawyer. The lawyer informed me that without physical proof, such as a recording from the camera or the device itself, pressing charges would be difficult. Even if the clock was indeed a hidden camera, Craig could simply claim it was a harmless motion sensor. Without evidence, it would be my word against his. I wanted to return and photograph it, but my lawyer strongly advised against going back to the house alone, and the thought of seeing Craig again made my skin crawl. So he faced no consequences. I was never paid for the 3 nights I stayed there. The woman who had recommended me to him stopped responding to my messages, and I never discovered if she knew anything about him. For weeks afterward, I suffered nightmares about waking to a camera lens watching me from across the room. I began inspecting every clock, smoke detector, and picture frame in my own apartment. I still frequently recall that moment when I peered into that tiny black lens and the sound of a door closing somewhere behind me in a house I had believed to be empty, leading me to suspect he might have been in the house the entire time, observing me through that camera. I reserved the Airbnb in late September, a week before my girlfriend Emma and I planned a short trip to visit her sister, who lived in a small town about 3 hours from our home. I chose it because it was affordable, conveniently located near her sister's place, had favorable reviews, and appeared cozy in the listing photos. An old 2-story house with a wraparound porch, warm yellow lighting in the living room, hardwood floors that imparted a storybook quality. A minor detail in the description, which I initially overlooked, was a note advising guests that the basement storage room was off-limits. I had stayed in accommodations where owners kept certain areas locked. It's quite common for them to store personal belongings, so it barely registered as significant. However, when we arrived in the driveway just before sunset on our first evening, the place looked a bit more weathered than in the photographs. And the fact that it stood isolated, with only one other house visible a considerable distance away, surrounded by dark tree lines and accessed by a narrow road, made me pause. Our host, Alan, was waiting for us on the porch before we even exited the car. He was tall but slightly stooped, perhaps in his late 50s, with thin grey hair neatly combed over his head. He wore a perfectly pressed flannel shirt tucked into his jeans. He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, reminiscent of Mr. Beast, a little too practiced. His gaze lingered on us a bit too long when we shook hands. Although his voice was friendly enough, there was a subtle firmness in his tone as he began our tour. He led us through the front door, into a hallway that carried a faint scent of dust and something sweet, almost like candle wax, though I saw no candles. The living room featured a large couch facing an old television. The kitchen appeared clean, but dated. Upstairs, the single bedroom contained a large bed beneath a ceiling fan and a small dresser with a mirror. Afterward, coming back downstairs, Alan paused at a door near the kitchen and tapped a heavy padlock securing it. In a more commanding tone, he informed us that this door would remain locked, that it was his storage space, and that there was no reason for us to go down there for anything. He did not smile this time. He then proceeded to show us where the extra towels were in the bathroom, before wishing us a pleasant stay and exiting through the front door. After he left, Emma and I unpacked, made some tea, and sat on the porch for a while, listening to crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the trees. By the time we went to bed, the quiet was almost unsettling. No traffic, No distant voices, just pure silence. Sometime after midnight, I thought I heard a faint, dull thud from below us. I paused and listened for more, but it didn't repeat. So I convinced myself it was probably the house settling. The next morning we had breakfast in town, explored a few shops, and met Emma's sister for lunch. We stayed out until just after dark, then returned to the house to prepare dinner and watch a movie. Around 2 a.m., I awoke to use the bathroom. As I headed back toward the bedroom, I froze halfway up the stairs when I heard a dragging sound from the basement, like something heavy being pulled across a rough floor. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, stopped, and then resumed. My initial thought was that Alan might have returned for something, but he had explicitly told us he would not be around at all during our stay. I stood there listening until it ceased, then went into the bedroom and whispered to Emma, asking if she was awake. She confirmed she was and had heard it too. We remained awake for another half hour, but the sound did not return. The second night was worse. We had spent the day hiking and were exhausted, but sometime around 2:30 a.m., the noises started again. Not dragging this time, but footsteps. 4 or 5 in a row, then a pause, then 3 more. Each interlude lingered just long enough to suggest that an unseen presence might be listening. Emma whispered her conviction that she could discern breathing sounds between the footsteps. My heart pounded, yet I dared not stir, fearing any noise I might make. So we remained motionless, eyes wide, fixed on the ceiling, until dawn. By the third morning, a palpable shift had occurred in the house's atmosphere. We continued our tourist activities, but upon our return, a distinct heaviness seemed to settle over the rooms. I resolved to inspect the basement door during the day. It remained locked, but as I drew nearer, I detected a faint, unpleasant odor, a blend of stale, damp air with a sour undertone. That night, the disturbances commenced earlier, around midnight. First, a faint metallic clinking, as if metal tapped against a hard surface. Then, the footsteps resumed, persisting intermittently for nearly an hour. Emma spoke little to me before bed that night. The fourth night proved to be the breaking point. While preparing for bed, Emma paused from brushing her hair and inquired if the smoke detector above the bed appeared unusual. Initially, I saw nothing amiss, but upon standing on the bed for a closer look, I noticed a small, perfectly round black dot in its center, shinier than the surrounding plastic. An immediate sense of dread washed over me. I retrieved a chair, unscrewed the detector, and inside discovered a small battery-operated camera with its green light illuminated. Emma sat on the bed, pale and silent, as I scoured the remainder of the room, locating another small lens protruding from a hole in the wall near the dresser mirror, both positioned directly toward the bed. That was the absolute end of it. We hastily crammed our belongings into our bags without bothering to fold anything, and departed the house without a word to the host, driving to the nearest gas station to contact the police. 2 officers met us there. We recounted everything: the noises, the cameras, the locked basement, and they accompanied us back to the house. The front door was unlocked. Technically, we were still permitted on the property, as we had paid for 4 days. The police followed us inside and confiscated all evidence, including, I presume, the cameras, memory cards, and any recording equipment they could find. They also took our detailed statements, inquiring if any unusual events had transpired during our stay. It was then that we mentioned hearing strange noises from the basement on both nights. When we pointed out the basement door, we were shocked to find it wide open, revealing only pitch darkness within. We informed them that this door had previously been locked and that the host had been very evasive about not venturing down there. Consequently, the officers descended the stairs to investigate. Moments later, we heard voices, raised voices. A commotion was unfolding down there, and the nature of the situation quickly became apparent. The officers then summoned us downstairs and asked if the individual present was the host. To our horror, it was Alan. He was apparently concealed in a closet in the basement. Within this closet was a monitor, which we could only surmise was receiving footage from the basement. The police seized this item as well. Alan was arrested almost immediately and charged criminally by the state for criminal trespass and invasion of privacy. We were not required to testify in court or any similar proceedings. The police simply forwarded our statements to the prosecutor. I believe Airbnb essentially offered us a voucher, hoping we would keep our negative experience to ourselves. We accepted the voucher, of course, but that has not deterred us from relaying this horrifying ordeal to others. It has truly had a lasting impact on Emma and me. We no longer trust rentals or Airbnbs and have recently opted exclusively for hotels. My name is Joe, and this occurred about a week ago. I reside in a 2-bedroom apartment with my roommate, Eric. I did not know him prior to moving in. We connected through a Facebook housing group. He seemed sufficiently normal when we first met to tour the apartment. He was quiet, polite, and somewhat awkward, but not in an off-putting way. At the time, I considered this a positive trait, as I wasn't seeking a best friend, merely someone responsible enough to contribute to the rent and maintain the apartment. For the initial couple of months, everything was fine. We maintained opposing work schedules. I worked a conventional 9-to-5 office job, and he was employed at some warehouse on the late shift. Consequently, I rarely saw him. Most mornings when I left, his door would be closed, and in the evenings upon my return, he was usually out. We would cross paths once or twice a week, typically exchanging a few words in the kitchen or living room. It was nothing remarkable, but it functioned effectively. Then, I began to notice subtle things in my room that unsettled me. The first instance occurred when I arrived home late and observed that my closet door was ajar. I habitually keep it closed to avoid seeing my clothes, but I rationalized that I might have left it that way that morning. A few days later, I noticed my desk chair was turned slightly toward the bed. I never position it that way. Again, I dismissed it, thinking I might simply have been inattentive. Still, it evoked an odd sensation in my stomach, as if someone had been in my room. One Saturday morning, I was cleaning. I wiped the shelves, dusted, and then commenced cleaning the window. That's when I saw it. High in the corner, where the wall met the ceiling, was this tiny black dot. I initially thought it might be a screw or a hole in the wall, but upon closer inspection, I froze. It was a minuscule camera, a small wireless camera pointed directly at my bed. My hand trembled as I detached it from the wall. It wasn't even well concealed, merely affixed with a small piece of adhesive. It had a slot for a memory card, but the card was absent. I simply stood there, holding it, feeling ill. I reflected on all the nights I had been in here sleeping, changing clothes, even being intimate with women. The only individual who could have placed it there was Eric. He was the only other person with access to my room. At that moment, he was not home. His door was closed, and the apartment was quiet. I stood in the hallway, staring at his door, my heart pounding. I cautioned myself against it, but curiosity prevailed. I slowly turned his doorknob and opened it. His room smelled stale, like old food and dirty laundry. The blinds were drawn, and the room was dark despite it being midday. His bed was unmade, and his desk was cluttered with papers, unopened mail, and loose change. I searched around a bit, half expecting to discover another camera, or perhaps recordings on his laptop. But there was nothing overt, just a messy room. I closed the door and returned to my room, but I couldn't shake the unease. I decided to put him to the test. I placed the camera in my nightstand drawer beneath some socks. My plan was straightforward. If he came searching for it, I would know definitively that he was the one who planted it. For 2 nights, nothing transpired. I still felt tense, but since there were no indications, I began to think I was overthinking the entire situation. Then came the third night. I awoke around 3 o'clock in the morning. Initially, I was unsure why, but then I heard a sound. It was soft, like wood sliding against wood. Then I realized it was emanating from right beside me, from my nightstand drawer. I opened my eyes slightly, feigning sleep. In the faint light filtering through the blinds, I discerned a figure. It was Eric. He was standing in my room, bent over my nightstand, rummaging through the drawer where I had concealed the camera. I felt my chest tighten, and my heart beat so loudly I was certain he could hear it. I remained still, uncertain of what to do. And then he stopped. He froze and stood there completely motionless. Slowly, he turned his head toward my bed. He was looking directly at me. For a moment, I thought perhaps he wasn't sure if I was awake. But then he spoke. He said he knew I was awake. I felt a chill run down my spine as he uttered that. Then he asked me what I had done with it. I sat up quickly, my fear transforming into anger. I demanded to know why he had placed a camera in my room. He stared at me and asserted it was because he suspected me of stealing from him. I told him that was absurd, that it made no sense. I highlighted that he had aimed the camera at my bed and that it was one of the most depraved things I'd ever witnessed. He attempted to argue that he only wanted proof, but I didn't believe him. I accused him of lying and of having spied on me. We began to yell at each other. He kept reiterating that I was overreacting. I informed him I would report him to the landlord and possibly even the police. My voice trembled with both fear and rage. Finally, I yanked open the drawer, seized the camera, and held it up. I told him this was proof and that he would never get it back. I stormed out of my room, walked into the kitchen, and threw the camera directly into the garbage, believing I had broken it. I instructed him to stay out of my room and declared that the following day I would inform the landlord of everything. Eric stood in the hallway with his fists clenched, staring at me with a blank expression. Then he turned and walked back into his room without another word. I did not sleep the remainder of that night. I sat on the couch with the TV on, too afraid he might re-enter my room. Every minor sound in the apartment made me jump. When the sun finally rose, I checked the garbage can. The camera was gone. That was a week ago. I informed the landlord of what happened. He said he would investigate, but thus far, nothing has been done. Eric still resides here. We do not speak, but the way he looks at me when we pass each other makes my skin crawl. It's as if he's waiting for me to say or do something. I don't know his true motive for placing the camera in my room. His excuse about me stealing was an obvious fabrication. I don't know what he intended to record or what he planned to do with it. And honestly, I don't want to know. Yet, as I settle into bed each evening, I'm haunted by the persistent sensation that additional cameras remain concealed, perhaps in spots I wouldn't readily inspect. I've thoroughly searched the room, yet found nothing. Still, the idea persistently occupies my thoughts. Last night, I was awake late when I distinctly heard footsteps approach down the hallway, only to halt directly outside my door. For over a minute, an eerie silence settled, broken only by faint creaks in the wooden floor, emanating from the pressure of his presence. He lingered there, a disconcerting figure, for several minutes until his footsteps eventually receded from my door. I am now exploring options to relocate. Concurrently, I'm investigating the feasibility of pursuing legal action for invasion of privacy or a similar offense. This is especially challenging since I failed to photograph the camera or document our confrontation. Furthermore, I lack any text messages where he admits to